I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com, and here today with me is Dr. Jonathan Newman, fellow at the Mises Institute. Thank you so much for being here. Great to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great.
Of course, really exciting to be speaking with you today. I think it's going to be a fun conversation. Just because it is our first time talking, I wondered if you could start with a brief introduction to yourself and your work.
Sure. My name is Jonathan Newman, and I'm the Henry Hazlitt Research Fellow here at the Mises Institute. The Mises Institute is an educational organization that its mission is to teach and promote Austrian economics, honest history, international peace. And so our namesake is Ludwig von Mises, and so we hold up his ideas very highly, as well as his student Murray Rothbard. And so Austrian economics is it's sort of our main thing, and Austrian economics is a particular way of approaching economic questions. So me in particular, I do research, I do interviews like this, I write articles for academic journals, but also for our website. And I also teach in our various student seminars and conferences, and everything that we do is centered on teaching Austrian economics. And so I'm happy to be a part of that.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And we are going to go in that educational direction today. I was telling you before we turned the camera on, I talked to a lot of people who are proponents of Austrian economics, but we don't often get into exactly what that means. So with you today, that's where we're going to go. I wondered if you could start by talking about the principles that people should know when they're thinking about Austrian economics.
Sure. So I guess we could start with its name. So why is it called Austrian economics? There was a man by the name of Carl Menger who wrote in the 1870s a book called Principles of Economics. And he wrote along around the same time as a couple others in the history of economic thought by the names of William Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras. But Carl Menger was in Austria, and his approach to dealing with economic issues was unique. And so what he did was he considered the individual, and he looked at cause and effect, and he approached economic questions in a more qualitative way. So he didn't have a lot of equations. He didn't treat people's utility as a function that people are trying to maximize. He didn't treat people as, like these calculators. And so he considered real people. He considered the way that we all act, the way that we all make choices. And he noticed, he saw, he discovered the way that we do that is by selecting means to attain an end. And so that's really the starting point of Austrian economics. It's called the action axiom. When we act, when we choose, we're selecting means to attain some desired end. And those ends are subjective. They're personal for us. We can't attach some number to that satisfaction that we get, like from, consuming a hamburger, for example. There's not a number that we can attach to it. And so that's why a lot of Austrian economics proceeds in that sort of qualitative way, as opposed to assigning numbers. We don't do a lot of math for that reason. It's not because we're bad at math or we're scared of it or something like that, which is, sometimes a stereotype, but it's because we realize that people don't do math when they're making those choices. They're not optimizing some utility function. Anyway, so Carl Menger wrote Principles of Economics, and that's why the school is called Austrian economics. But he had students like Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, who's also from Austria, Ludwig von Mises, obviously. And then the school came over to the Americas. And so we had people like Frank Fetter and Murray Rothbard, who really brought the Austrian school ideas over to this continent. And now we have the Mises Institute, and we have some schools like universities, like there's George Mason, there's Grove City College, there's Hillsdale, who are also teaching Austrian economics in their curriculum here in the United States. So a lot of times when people hear the term Austrian economics, they think, oh, is that only in Austria, or is that just the economics of Austria? And so that's not the case. It's the name of a school of thought about how we approach economic questions, economic concepts, and it doesn't just apply to Austria. So, but as I mentioned, one of the main distinctives is the way that we go about it, our methodology. So it's sometimes called a praxeology, but it's just this verbal, logical, step-by-step method where we're uncovering universally true cause and effect relationships about how people choose, how people interact in markets, what market prices mean, the importance of economic calculation like profit and loss, that sort of thing, and the implications of that. So what happens when you have an increase in the money supply? What happens when there's a price control? How can we think about what governments do with their spending and their taxing? So we just sort of proceed that way, going step by step, and we have this huge body of economic ideas given to us by people like Carl Menger, Ludwig von Mises, and Murray Rothbard.
I think that's a great overview, a good starting point for us. And just because you mentioned some misconceptions that people might have, you're talking about people think Austrian economists are bad at math, or maybe this is just for Austria. What other common misconceptions would you pull out for people to know about?
Great question. One misconception is that we're just free market ideologues. A lot of people think that we go backwards, that we start with this ideal that we have, which is we want limited government or even no government. So like we start with what our ideal society would look like, and then we just work backwards to try to figure out, okay, how can we use economic vocabulary to justify that sort of end state that we want? But in fact, it goes the opposite direction. So I can't deny that many of the conclusions of Austrian economics lend themselves towards those sorts of laissez-faire policy prescriptions. But the point is that the way that the logic is set up, like if you read Principles of Economics by Menger, or if you read Man, Economy, and State, you see that they're starting from scratch. They're starting with the individual, they're starting with action, and then they proceed to like a barter economy, into a money-using economy, a division of labor. And they add these complications, and a lot of the conclusions is that what people do in free markets is the best that they can do. So when entrepreneurs are free to own the means of production and make judgments about what consumers want in the future, and they're guided by profit and loss considerations, then they will make things that consumers want. So consumers are the ones who are ultimately in charge of the decisions that entrepreneurs are making. Consumers have the final say. So consumers can say, yes, I will buy your product, or no, I won't buy your product. So that means that the consumer is sovereign, and that's a term that Ludwig von Mises used. And so this all works. This works well, and it's all directed towards consumer satisfaction. But what that means is if the government steps in, so they impose something like a price control, then that necessarily limits the free exchange, that limits this process by which consumers are satisfied, that throws a wrench into this system. Or if the government taxes, that just removes people's ability to purchase things, that removes the incentive on the part of entrepreneurs to produce things that consumers want. When the government spends, when the government is spending money, it's not subject to this profit and loss test of the market, which means we can't really say for sure if what the government is spending money on is something that's actually beneficial. Since people aren't voluntarily paying for the services that the government offers, the best we can say is, maybe it's okay, but it's likely to be a waste. However, in the case of the private market economy, like I said, consumers have this final say. They can decide, yes, I will buy this product, and if what they're willing to pay is enough to justify the costs of production, then that entrepreneur is rewarded, and we can say that resources were economized. We used productive resources in the best way possible. So notice that I'm going step by step in explaining how all of this is directed towards consumer satisfaction, and there's really not a role for government to improve that process, which means that Austrian economics sort of tends in that direction of, like, if you want human flourishing, if you want people to be better off, if you want higher standards of living, then the prescription, if you're like a policy advisor, is the government should be hands off. The government should not do anything. And so a lot of people, they only see those conclusions. They only see those prescriptions, and so they incorrectly conclude that we're just these free market ideologues that are, we just don't like the government for its own sake, and therefore we're going to, try to arrange our economic theory to justify those conclusions, when in fact it goes the other way.
If we're talking about Austrian economics, we need to take a look at the Fed. So I know you're very critical of the Fed. Many of the other people on our channel very critical of the Fed. But you've actually taken a look at how we could come to an end for the Fed. A lot of people talk about it. You've actually broken down how that could happen. I don't want to make you give your whole talk again, but I wonder if you can give a brief look at how exactly that happened, because you laid out quite well.
Yeah, so I gave a talk at a recent event on how to end the Fed, and I based it on something that Murray Rothbard wrote. So he wrote this series of 3 essays, and those 3 essays have since been put together in a little booklet that's published by the Mises Institute called "Taking Back Our Money." And in this third essay, Rothbard he outlines how we could go about ending the Fed. And it involves treating it like an insolvent bank. So we have to liquidate its assets. We've got to transfer its liabilities probably to the Treasury. So the U.S. government would have to remove its charter. That would have to be something that's done by Congress. So in terms of the mechanics, like what actually needs to be done to end the Fed, it's fairly simple. Just treat it like an insolvent bank. So what I did in my talk was I sort of took a step back. It's like, okay, how do we get there? How do we get to the point where we can actually go through that process where Congress is voting to end the Fed and the president is online, those sorts of things, the president is in line with this sort of thing, because it would require a majority in Congress and an anti-Fed president to actually get there. And so I took the step back and I asked, okay, what conditions have to be met for that to occur? And so that's why the conclusion that I came to is we need education. We need to convince people that the Fed is bad. We need to convince people that what the Fed is doing is not necessary and it's not beneficial. And this is an especially difficult task because the Fed has been around for a long time. I contrasted our current central bank to the second bank of the United States, which was ended by Andrew Jackson. So the question is it even possible to end the Fed? You have to say, well, it is possible. A lot of people think that this is sort of like an impossible task, but it is possible because we've actually ended a central bank before. And so the second bank of the United States was ended by Andrew Jackson. And so what were the conditions that made that possible? Well, there was a popular understanding in the voting public. There was a popular understanding that inflation was bad, price inflation was bad, and that it was the central bank's fault. So that people realized that price inflation, like when I'm paying more money for paying higher prices for groceries and all the things that I need, people realize that this is not the greed of the grocery store owner. This is not just something that's like an inherent feature of the market economy. People realize that it was the central bank's fault because they were printing up all these notes. So there was a popular understanding, and that led to people electing people in Congress and also Andrew Jackson who were anti-Fed. So that was one condition. Is like there was this popular, by popular I mean broad. I mean there was a broad understanding that the central bank at the time was causing these ills. Another thing that was a part of the set of conditions that made ending the second bank of the United States possible was that there was actually an opportunity. So the second bank of the United States was up for a renewal of its charter. And so that gave Andrew Jackson this opportunity to not renew the charter. Right. So that's one thing that we don't have today. So I would say we don't have either one of those conditions. We don't have an opportunity because the Fed has a perpetual charter. It's not like the Fed has to reapply for its ability to be the central bank, every 10 years or something like that. That would be nice because then we can have this public battle. But we also don't have this popular understanding. So we can create the conditions. Just because the Fed doesn't have like a charter renewal period, that doesn't mean that there's not an opportunity to end the Fed. It just means that it would have to come from Congress as an act. And so somebody like Thomas Massie has proposed such a bill to end the Fed. And he goes through a process that's very similar to what Rothbard wrote about, involving liquidating its assets, transferring its liabilities to the Treasury, and it's overseen by the OMB. And so he has all this process laid out such that the Fed would be effectively ended in 1 year. But like I said, what I talked about in this talk, what do we need to get there? We need education. We need people to understand that the Fed is at fault for causing the business cycle, the Fed is at fault for our government being as large as it is. The Fed is at fault for price inflation. The Fed is at fault for, once you consider all of the other unintended consequences, all the knock-on effects of price inflation and how that changes people's psychology and the culture, the Fed is responsible for all sorts of ills in American society. And as soon as people, click onto that, as soon as people start to realize that, then I think we could see popular support for ending the Fed, and it could happen.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you lay out how it could happen, but there are barriers in place right now. And it's like people are almost there, where right now, especially, people are aware of inflation, but I don't think they're making that connection back to the Fed, for example. So in your view, is it realistic to think that we can get to that point where people start making those connections and we go in the direction that you're talking about?
I think so. I mean, we've seen some very dramatic changes in culture and in public understanding. Just like there were some dramatic changes that happened even through the COVID years, right? So I think so. Right now, we definitely don't have those conditions. We definitely don't have a popular understanding that the Fed is bad and the Fed is unnecessary. But I think it's possible. Like we've seen huge political shifts just in the past decade, right? So and people are changing their minds. They're I think that people are more like anti-interventionist when it comes to foreign policy, whereas maybe 20 years ago they were more in favor of that. I think people are more distrustful of the experts because they saw all sorts of different pronouncements during the COVID regime. And so people are distrustful of like a technocratic elite. And so like I could easily see how people could be convinced that, hey, the Fed is a part of this technocratic elite. So maybe they're not right all the time. And so I could easily see how people would realize or attach those negative feelings that they have about the experts misleading them in the past and attach that to the Fed. I think it's possible. I mean, it's gonna take a lot of hard work. I'm not saying that it's easy. Maybe it's not even likely, but it's certainly possible.
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking is it feels like, I mean, change is hard for people, and it feels like it could potentially be a painful transition. So you almost have to convince people that what's happening now is worse than whatever the painful transition could be at the end of it. Any thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, so a lot of people bring this up. As soon as I mention ending the Fed, a lot of people talk about how painful it would be. And so my response is that, yeah, there would definitely be some like short-term pain, right? It's like you gotta rip the Band-Aid out or rip the Band-Aid off. I mean, and so it hurts. There would definitely be, there are many sectors of the American economy that are dependent on consistent monetary inflation. So, especially in the finance arena, insurance, real estate, these sorts of sectors, there would be a large reckoning, right? But as soon as you realize that the reason why there's such a large reckoning is because these sectors have been inflated. They're bloated because of their proximity to the money printer, not because there's real underlying demand for all of these services. It's not like people are willing to or like naturally willing to pay these super high prices for houses, for example. As soon as you realize that the reason why there would be so much pain in the short run is because they've been unnaturally, artificially inflated. Then you realize, well, so we have two options. We can either stop the artificial bloating, or we can try to, continue on. But that just means that we'll have larger crises, larger problems in the future. So I get that there's a balance. Like, yeah, there's going to be some short-term pain, but, to do the right thing sometimes requires a little bit of pain. But I think that the long-term gain is more than worth it, because what would we get if we ended the Fed, if we weren't dependent on this money printer for a huge government? We would get smaller government that's constrained by its ability to tax and to borrow, as opposed to a government that can just spend as much as it wants because it can print money to finance its deficits. We would get no or fewer business cycles, depending on changes to the banking system that happen after the Fed has ended. So we get sustainable economic growth. We would get more capital accumulation and saving. So people would actually have an incentive to save for the future, and it would be easier and better to create sustainable capital investments in businesses, as opposed to being subject to these business cycle swings. I see long-term sustainable growth, higher standards of living, a better culture, better society, long-run better economy.
I wonder if we can talk about the role of gold in Austrian economics and potentially in ending the Fed as well. We've got an audience that has a strong focus on gold, believes in gold as sound money. So I'm wondering if you can shed light on its role in these systems.
Yeah. So the way Austrian economics views gold is as a commodity, as it's a good, much like any other. Now, it has a special historical role because gold was used as money for a very long time, and before that, silver was used as money almost globally. Not almost, but globally, silver was used as money. So money has special characteristics, but money is just a good. A lot of the errors that come from monetary theory come from trying to make money more than what it is or less than what it is. So a lot of people think about money as or gold as having like intrinsic value, or they try to turn money into, I think Elon Musk called it like an economic database or database of value or something like that. And it just doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense in terms of Austrian economics. The way that we should think about money, whether it's fiat money or commodity money, whether it's backed by gold, whether it's backed by silver, anything, we should think about it as a good that people value, and they have subjective values for this money. So why do people hold on to it? They hold on to it because they expect to be able to spend it in the future. And that applies to the fiat dollar. Like, why am I willing to get paid in US dollars, even though I realize that it's fiat money and I disagree with this system and I think it's despicable, right? It's like, why do I agree to get paid in US dollars? And the answer is because I expect to be able to spend it at the grocery store. I expect to be able to fill up my gas tank by spending US dollars. So a lot of people, I love the spirit. A lot of people, they reach too far in claiming that the US dollar is not money because it's not backed by gold. But I don't think that's the truth. So if we define money as the widely accepted medium of exchange, then the US dollar is the widely accepted medium of exchange here in the US, which means that it's money. Now, we can disagree with it. We can say that it's bad. It's a bad money. It's an unsound money. And I would completely agree with all of those statements. But a lot of people say that the only money is gold, and I would say that that's incorrect. What has happened is that the government has taken over the monetary system. So we used to have this market-based system where gold developed as money because people realized that it was superior as a medium of exchange. People could use it they could receive it in one transaction, and they could divide it up. They can make coins out of it, and they could then go purchase the things that they want for their own direct use in the market. So gold and silver were, superior at that. They were great at that. I would say that they would still be great as a money, right? But then what happened is we had banks come in and they started keeping fractional reserves. And so they would issue these banknotes, and the banknotes would be issued in excess of the gold reserves that they had. And so that's an important psychological switch, because people started to associate money with pieces of paper as opposed to gold coins. And then the government realized that, these bank runs, all the banking crises that come from fractional reserve banking, all of these things are unpopular. And I think governments also were jealous that banks were able to create new money, because that's a nice power to have. And so I think governments commandeered this ability. Governments created central banks so that they could get in on the action, the money printing action, because they could benefit as a result. And so in 1913 in the United States, we had the Federal Reserve Act. So we have a central bank now that's a lender of last resort. It's protecting the banking system from its unwise decisions. And then in 1933, FDR made gold illegal, so people couldn't redeem their their notes, their pieces of paper for gold. And then in 1971, we had Nixon come off the gold standard, even for foreign governments and foreign central banks. They couldn't redeem their dollars for gold. And so now what we're left with is just this purely paper fiat money. So the way that I look at that historically is it's a bunch of little baby steps towards this terrible system that we have now, which is that the government can spend as much as it wants because it has a ready buyer of its debt with newly printed money. So it's a bad system. It's terrible. But we can say that without saying the US dollar is not real money, which is a claim that I often hear from people who are proponents of gold.
Yeah, that is a claim that does come up with relative frequency. On the note of gold, I also wanted to mention these gold revaluation ideas that have been, I think, floating around. I mean, I would say I've seen more of them since Trump began his second presidency. People talking about, well, maybe this is a way that we can deal with that massive debt in the US. Any thoughts on gold revaluation and how it fits into the picture that you're looking at?
Yeah, so if we were to end the Fed, it means that we'd have to replace it with something. The U.S. dollar wouldn't be Federal Reserve notes anymore. And so the idea from Murray Rothbard is to revalue the gold. It's to obviously we can't go back to $20 per ounce. We can't go back to $35 an ounce, or what was it, $44 per ounce. So there were successive revaluations of gold. So we can't go back to those values because the market price of gold, I don't even know what it is today. It's like close to 5,000, something like that.
Yeah, thereabouts.
Yeah. So obviously we can't go back to those exchange ratios if we were going to go back to a gold-backed dollar. So I would say that what would have to happen is you'd have to say that a dollar is now worth like 1/5,000th of an ounce of gold, something like that. So if we're going to go back to a gold-based monetary system, you'd have to do something that's closer to the market price of gold. Now, in terms of ending the Fed and liquidating its assets and moving its liabilities to the Treasury, the Fed owns gold certificates, but they're non-marketable and they're non-redeemable. So they're literally just like this accounting ghost that it's on their books, but it doesn't really mean anything because it's not like the Fed can take these gold certificates to the Treasury and say, "Hey, give us our gold," because they're not redeemable. And it's not like the Fed can sell these certificates and for some based on the market price of gold because they're non-marketable. So the Fed is just sitting on this pile of paper that's meaningless. However, if in the process of ending the Fed, you combine the Fed's assets and liabilities with the Treasury, since the Treasury is the one that owns the gold and is holding the gold, then the Treasury would be able to revalue the gold and sell it so that it can redeem some of the Fed's liabilities. Now, one thing that makes this really easy is that a lot of the stuff that's on the Fed's balance sheet is actually owed to the Treasury. And so if you combine those two entities, then they just go away. So all of the government debt that the Federal Reserve is holding on to, if that's given to the Treasury, then it just goes away. It just cancels out. And so that makes the process easier. It's not like a lot of people look at the size of the Fed's balance sheet and they think, "Oh man, it's like how are we gonna liquidate this thing?" But it's easier than it looks because a lot of it just goes away. And also there's all of the gold certificates. I think the gold certificates are on the Fed's books at like $42.22 an ounce or something like that, which was based on an older exchange ratio. But what that means is the gold that the Fed owns in the form of those certificates, even though it's non-marketable and non-redeemable, if those are transferred to the Treasury would be able to revalue those and sell it for a lot more. I haven't done the calculation, sell it for a lot more money to be able to pay down the Fed's debts.
Okay, really interesting to look at how gold fits into the picture. And if we take a step back, say that the US goes in that direction where they end the Fed, we go in the direction that you're talking about, how does the US then continue to interact with the rest of the world? Does that keep working, assuming that the rest of the world keeps their central banks, they're doing their own thing? How do you see that working?
Well, I think the U.S. would be in a much better position internationally. So what we see now is the U.S. has definitely benefited from being the issuer of the U.S. dollar and the fact that the U.S. dollar is held as this global reserve currency. So that's like a vestige of the Bretton Woods system that was ended in 1971. And, thankfully through diplomacy, through wars, through having a huge military, I guess, that system was maintained that was a great benefit to American citizens, right? Because if you think about it, the U.S. was able to export all of these dollars that people were willing to hold on to, and the U.S. was able to receive a bunch of valuable goods and services in exchange. So the U.S. has had this sort of like outsized ability to consume because of that system. But the issue is like that system can't last forever. So it's not like you can just, ship out green pieces of paper forever and just get goods and services in return, because sooner or later people get wise to the fact. And I think people are starting to get wise to this fact, and mainly it's because of unforced errors on the part of the U.S. government. The major one being using the U.S. dollar as a weapon, using the U.S. dollar as a way to punish other countries. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, one thing that the U.S. did was it sanctioned Russia and it confiscated all of the dollar-denominated assets that people in Russia owned, and it removed Russia from the SWIFT system. It wasn't just the U.S., but there was a consortium of countries that removed Russia from the SWIFT system. But if you think about what that signals, whatever you think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, whatever you think about anything regarding that conflict, what that signals is, if you use the dollar, you have to stay in our good graces. If you want to use this international payment system, if you want dollar-denominated assets, then you better not do anything that would upset us, right? So that's what it's signaling. And so I think a lot of these other countries like India and Brazil and China, they're looking at that and they're thinking, maybe we should look at alternatives. Maybe we shouldn't be so heavily invested in the U.S. dollar and treasury securities. And so I think that has sped up this de-dollarization. I have no idea. I know the question that you're probably thinking in your mind is, okay, when is this going to happen? Like when is the de-dollarization going to happen? I have no idea about the timeline, because a lot of it just depends on global events, changes in geopolitics, changes in wars going on. A lot of it depends on the psychology of the leaders of these different countries and their legislatures, right? So I have no idea how long it would take, but I do know that we're on a trend now where countries they're rethinking this dependence on the dollar because the U.S. is using the dollar as a weapon. And so one result of that is that makes it less possible for the U.S. to ship out these green pieces of paper and receive goods and services in return. And what that means is that it makes it even harder for the Fed to engage in the monetary policy that it wants to, whereas before it was much easier because there was huge global demand for U.S. dollars.
Yeah. I won't ask you when. I know those questions are way too tricky to answer most of the time. But before I let you go, we're getting to the end. But I did want to ask, are you paying attention to what the Fed is doing on a day-to-day basis? Because we're kind of at an interesting time right now. We've got this Fed chair transition coming up. Right now, we've got increasing concerns about inflation. I know that people thought with a new Fed chair coming in, that person would be more amenable to what Trump would like, which is lower interest rates. But now we've got inflation coming. So what do you see coming? How are you looking at more the day-to-day situation for the Fed right now?
Yeah, it is really interesting. I wouldn't say I watch, day to day, but I do tune in whenever they have a new decision on monetary policy and there's a press conference, because, every now and then one of the reporters in the room will ask a decent question. So I do watch those, but it has been very entertaining to watch the sort of drama between Jay Powell and Donald Trump. So a lot of people view what's going on as a threat to the Fed's independence, because Trump has said stuff about wanting to fire Jerome Powell. He's initiated these lawsuits against different officials at the Fed like Lisa Cook, and actually even there's a criminal suit against Jerome Powell regarding some statements he made about renovations at the Fed building. So a lot of people view this as like undue political influence on the Fed, and it's threatening the Fed's independence. But my view is that the Fed is not independent. The Fed's independence is a complete myth. And a lot of people point to this event that happened in 1951 called the Treasury-Fed Accord. And a lot of people point to that event as where the Fed established its independence. Now, the Fed wasn't going to do whatever the Treasury wanted. But so I gave a speech about that, and I've written some articles. So if your listeners are interested, they could go check that out. But the point is that the Fed is not independent. It is independent in rhetoric alone. So when Jerome Powell is making speeches, when congressmen are talking about the Fed, they'll talk about how the Fed is independent. But this is just speech. So if you look at what the Fed actually does, it's like, what does the Fed actually do when there's a crisis? What does the Fed do when the federal government needs to borrow trillions of dollars, like what happened during COVID? What does the Fed do when the financial system is collapsing? And the answer is the Fed cooperates with the federal government. The Fed cooperates with the Treasury. The Fed cooperates with FDIC and the SEC. The Fed cooperates with all of these, parts of the government in doing what the government wants to do. In terms of like increasing spending, handing out stimulus checks, bailing out banks, the Fed is there to do whatever the government wants. But also, if you just think about the mechanics of what the Fed does, the Fed purchases the government's debt, right? So the Fed is always a ready buyer, and they do it with newly printed money. The Fed is always a ready buyer of the government's debt. So there's no independence at all. The only independence is, maybe there's some personal conflicts, some personal, differences of opinion between like some people at the Fed and some people in the presidential administration. And that's why you see these sort of like heated exchanges about, I'm going to fire you, and here's a criminal lawsuit. But I consider all of this political theater. Like, if you truly understand the nature of the Fed, you realize that it is the government's money printer. There's no independence at all. It will do whatever the Treasury needs it to do at the end of the day. So a lot of people are talking about these recent events as a threat to the Fed's independence. And I'm just, eating my popcorn, watching the political theater, enjoying it, but understanding that the Fed is not independent at all.
Yeah. The level of drama is constantly surprising to me there. All right. Well, thank you for going into that as well. And just before I let you go, we've covered, I think, a lot of ground that should be helpful to everybody. But any final thoughts that you would want to close with today?
Sure. I would just recommend to your listeners, your viewers, to check out Mises.org, MISES.org. We've got daily articles there about current events, stuff on the war in Iran, stuff about what's going on with the Federal Reserve and the U.S. economy. And so it's a great resource. We have all of the books and articles by Mises and Rothbard and Menger, who I mentioned. So we have this huge library that's available, and we also have events. So check out our event page, and we have events throughout the country. So if you're interested in meeting up with us and hearing people talk about free markets and international peace, then come join us. And thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. And I'll make sure to add some links in the video description so people can find them a little bit more easily. Thank you so much. This was great, very educational. And yeah, I think we hopefully shed a lot of light on Austrian economics for people who might not have known before. This was
absolutely
great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. And once again, I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com, and this is Dr. Jonathan Newman with the Mises Institute.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We'd also love to hear your thoughts, so leave us a comment below.